Hello everyone and welcome back to Chop It Up Sports. I'm your host Carter Stedman, and today we're going to be talking about college football. Week 1 is finally underway. We had games Thursday through Saturday. We even have a game tonight as LSU takes on USC in Las Vegas at Allegiant Stadium. And then for you people during the work week, on Monday night, we have Boston College as they take on Florida State as they look to bounce back after a tough loss against Georgia Tech in Dublin, Ireland last week. Man, it feels good to have college football back. It's my favorite sport. I think a lot of people will agree with that. There's just something about college football that clicks different. I don't know if it's the college atmosphere or it's the new playoff or whatever it may be, but to me, this is just a really exciting year. There's so much unknown, and week 1 proved that immediately. We're going to get into it here in a little bit. But there were so many questions that were answered and so many questions that we have left about a variety of teams and coaches. And so I think when you look at week 1 and you kind of look at the overarching view of it, a common theme that stood out to me was, a lot of teams struggled offensively on that side of the ball. And I think you can expect to see that in week 1, especially now in college football where you have so much change from year to year. So when you have different coordinators and you have players transferring in, things aren't going to look smooth right out of the gate in week 1. So it's going to take time. So if you're a team or a fan of a team that maybe didn't look as dominant as your team would have liked, maybe you're an Oregon fan and you just played Idaho and you just won by 10 points. I think it's okay. Just relax. Things are going to be fine. But there were some interesting questions, especially some things that stood out to me. And there are some great games all across the board this weekend, whether it's at the FCS level with Montana State knocking off New Mexico, or if you're North Dakota State. And we're going to hop into that game here in a little bit. And you gave a Colorado team that has a lot of hype around them everything that they could handle. And so I think week 1 is exciting, but it's also an opportunity for us to look at a lot of teams and realize, hey, things aren't going to be perfect out of the gate. There's going to be a lot of growing pains, and it's just about working through that, building that chemistry throughout the year. Now that we're in a 12-team playoff, there's more margin for error, So teams are going to be a little rocky to start. It's not like the NFL where you have the preseason and you're able to kind of filter out your depth chart. You're jumping right into it. If you're Georgia or you're a team like that, maybe you're Miami, and you have a major game week 1, you don't necessarily have the time to throw around a bunch of different looks and try and figure out who your starting offensive line is going to be, who's your starting receiver is going to be. You're jumping right into a big game and you have to be prepared to come out on top, because if you don't, that's going to hurt you at the end of the year when we're trying to figure out what 12 teams are going to make the best playoff for college football. So with that being said, we're going to hop into a couple games that I had the chance to watch over the weekend, and we're just going to break those down. I'm going to give you guys my takes on that. The first one came in on Thursday night, Colorado, North Dakota State, the Battle of the Bison. I guess a bison and a buffalo, if you want to get real technical with the mascots there. But this was a game that was really interesting to me. North Dakota State, we all know they're a powerhouse at the FCS level. Colorado struggled a little bit last year, a lot of hype around the team again this year. Deion Sanders is at the helm, as we all know. And they bring in 40 transfers this year, which is really impressive when you look at the fact that they brought in just as many transfers last year, and they didn't have the season that a lot of people expected they might have had. They bring in Warren Sapp as a defensive line coach. They bring in players from all over the country. Just a lot of talent and hype surrounding this Colorado team, and that's to be expected when you have a guy like Deion Sanders as your head coach and the face of the program, right? Immediately out of the gates in this game, we see what this Colorado team is going to be like: high-powered offense and a suspect defense. We start off the game with Travis Hunter going for a big touchdown from Shedeur Sanders in the air. And this was kind of a common theme throughout the night. I know Travis Hunter is super talented. He's one of the most dynamic players in college football, if not the most dynamic player. But there are a lot of holes in this North Dakota State defense that didn't really make a ton of sense. I think really just missing assignments in the secondary. We saw some safeties that are supposed to be playing over the middle that are lost. They're getting caught up on routes underneath. And that really opened up the passing game over the top for Shedeur Sanders. He had a monster game, 445 yards and 4 touchdowns in the air. And I think when you have a team like Colorado that you know what they're going to do, right? You know they're going to air it out. You know they're going to look for big-time plays. You can't afford to have miscues like that, especially in your secondary, because you know they're just going to be able to run up the scoreboard and ultimately run away from them. But that's not what happened today. North Dakota State was able to stay in it. They stayed composed, and they really gave the Buffs everything that they could have asked for. North Dakota State early on in this game, they really set the tone. I felt like you knew they were going to control the clock. They wanted to keep the ball out of the hands of Shedeur Sanders, and that's a smart strategy. You have to do that when you're the underdog. When you look at the stats, North Dakota State has 36 minutes of total possession, and Colorado only had 23. And so when you look at that, you think, okay, they're going to have the ball a lot, they're going to pound the rock, and just try and keep it as sloppy and as close of a game as possible. And in a sense, that's what happened, but I felt like North Dakota State was a lot better in the air than a lot of people expected. Sorry, my bad. But they did it through the air with Cam Miller. I felt like he had a great game. He made a lot of plays on his feet, and I just felt like he was able to keep a lot of plays alive and keep drives alive ultimately, just due to how skilled he was on his feet. Going into halftime, I feel like there's a couple missed opportunities for the Buffs. Right before half, Colorado marches down to kick a field goal to cut the lead down to 20-17. And at the time, you think, okay, that's fine. Like, you're going in with the lead on a big team, or you're going in with the lead as an underdog. But when you're a team like this and you're trying to upset a top team in the Big 12, you can't afford to make mental errors like that. You can't afford to let them pick up cheap points at the end of a half. You have to play clean, near perfect football, right? And we see that again at the beginning of the second half. Colorado starts, they push the ball straight down the field, and they're looking to take the lead. North Dakota State gets a freak interception. It bounces off a guy's foot or leg and ends up getting picked off in the end zone. You feel the momentum start to shift in that game. North Dakota State, they have the lead, they have the ball. If they can punch it in the end zone here, that makes it a two-possession game. And under 10 minutes in the third quarter, who knows what happens, right? Well, North Dakota State is unable to get anything with that. They have to punt, and so they're unable to capitalize off those turnovers. We saw those a couple times throughout this game. Another one that stood out to me was when North Dakota State stopped them on fourth down early in the first half, and rather than going down and scoring a touchdown, they get held to a field goal after a penalty-riddled drive that had them inside the 10, and they ultimately have to settle for a 25 to 30-yard field goal. And you just can't have that, right? When you're an FCS school and you're going up against a bigger opponent, you can't afford to settle. You have to go for it all. You have to be able to take advantage of turnovers. And North Dakota State, yes, they're able to force turnovers, and their defense needed what they needed to do in big moments. But unfortunately, the offense just wasn't able to produce at the level that they needed to in order to knock off a team like that. Now, if North Dakota State's out here playing South Dakota or North Dakota, then yeah, obviously you're going to be fine to be able to take your points, play your game, control the clock. But when you step up in a level in competition, you have to play perfect football. And we saw that with Idaho as well. We'll get into that game here in a second. But I did feel like this was a really good game. I do think if you're a Colorado fan, this defense has a lot to be concerned about. I didn't feel like they're great. If you give up 300 yards to a North Dakota State team, that's probably not something that I'm super excited about. I know Travis Hunter in the secondary is a great asset, but you have to find ways to get contributors around him. You can't have your whole defense relying on a guy who's playing both snaps, all the snaps on both sides of the ball, right? You have to be able to have playmakers at the linebacker position. You have to get guys in the backfield that will be disruptive. Your whole defense can't scheme around one cornerback who's playing both sides of the ball, right? It's just not going to be effective that way. But at the same time, North Dakota State's not a slouch, right? We've seen this before. There's a lot of teams this week that lost to FCS schools. And so I think for Colorado to come in and pick up a win against a really good North Dakota State team, that builds momentum. And we'll see in these coming weeks when they play Nebraska how legit this team's going to be. Will they be able to slow down Dylan Raiola? Can they put up points against these better defenses that they're going to face in the Big 12? These are a lot of questions that we still have. I think the offense is going to be fine no matter who they play. I think they're that explosive. I do think the defense, though, is going to have to be fixed, or it's going to be a really big problem. We saw it last year with USC under Lincoln Riley and Caleb Williams. They were able to put up a lot of points. That made them fun to watch, and they were competitive in all these games. But ultimately, when it comes down to winning time, if you have a defense that can't stop the team, that can't stop the opposition, then it's not necessarily going to matter how much points you put on the board if you can't stop a parked car, right? So going forward, I think this Colorado team, a lot of positives. I think there's a lot of good takeaways that they have, but the defense is going to have to pick it up in order for them to be successful in their first year into the Big 12. Saturday, we'll move on. Saturday morning in Atlanta, Georgia and Clemson, right? Georgia is the number one overall team in the country. Clemson comes in ranked at 14th in a weak ACC conference. I think the ACC is in trouble this year. We'll get into that here at the end of the episode. But Georgia, right, when you look at both of these teams, pretty similar in the sense that they probably were under expectations last year. Clemson, if you're a Clemson fan, you're probably wanting this team to be in the playoff. You think that they should have been competing for an ACC championship. Ultimately, that was not the case. They had a pretty disappointing year. And if you're Georgia, you go undefeated for essentially 2 years straight. You lose in your conference championship game, and just like that, you're out. So when you look at how these two teams are constructed, it's completely different though. Georgia's a team, they bring in a strong recruiting class, they utilize the portal heavily. Kirby Smart does a great job of getting talent through the portal to come into Georgia because ultimately, if you're a star prospect, why would you not want to come into Georgia? Why would you not want to have a chance to compete in the SEC at a high level and ultimately try and win a national championship? Clemson, however, they don't utilize the portal at not, and this is going to hurt them for as long as Dabo Swinney refuses to use the transfer portal. In this day and age in college football, you have to be able to acquire talent in any way possible. With how much money is involved and how big of a sponsorship and donor fund that Clemson has, you have to be able to utilize that. You can't afford to be stubborn about it, and whether you agree with the portal or not, you have to be able to use it to your advantage to get the best talent possible and get those guys on your roster. If you're Dabo Swinney, it's time to put the phone book away and go get an iPhone. You can't afford to keep losing talent to the portal and then refuse to bring in talent to replace those holes on the offensive and defensive end. And we saw that a lot this game with how many lack of weapons Clemson had around Cade Klubnik. And now listen, I don't think Cade Klubnik is a guy that's going to go out and win you a ton of games. But if he doesn't have anyone to throw the ball to, that just limits what he can do even more. You have to be able to surround him with talent. We see this a lot in college football with teams like Georgia in the past, and even teams like Alabama, where, yeah, their quarterbacks are good, maybe not great, but they're still able to go and win a national championship because of how many weapons they have around them, right? We know the wide receiving core and the running backs that have gone through the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Ohio States. And yes, they've had good quarterbacks, but you can also get away with having an adequate quarterback if you can surround him with good weapons. Unfortunately for Clemson, that's just not the case. They don't have a ton of guys that you can get the ball to that are going to be real threats, especially deep down the field. When I was looking at stats for this game and just trying to kind of dig up some research, the lack of depth that Clemson has at the running back position and at the wide receiver position really scares me. I understand that you might have a couple tier 1, tier 2 guys up top on the depth chart, but it really is about what's below that. And especially when you're playing an SEC team, you have to be able to throw out 3 or 4 different guys that can run the ball. You have to have anywhere from 4 to 5 different receivers and tight ends that you can get the ball in their hand, and they're going to be able to make a play. And unfortunately for Clemson, that's just not the case this season. And that's what really scares me about this team is, as a team that's favored to win the ACC, I don't understand where they're going to get this depth from. I don't understand people that have them up ranked this high. I think this Clemson team is really weak. I didn't like what I saw from Cade Klubnik at all. I think he lacks some decision making. I think he tries to do too much at times. And now listen, it's not all his fault. I understand that when you don't have a ton of weapons, it's harder to make plays. But ultimately, you're the quarterback. You have to be able to make smart decisions with the football. And I just didn't see a lot of that from him this game. And I haven't seen a lot of that from him in the past as well. But when you look at this game, it was a slow start for both teams. It's 6-0 Georgia going into the first half. There's nothing really that jumps out the chart. Obviously, Georgia is without Trevor Etienne for this game as he was suspended a couple days prior for personal reasons. And so when you look at the first half, there's really nothing to drive home about. I did think that this was going to be a little bit of a defensive battle early on, especially, with it being week 1 and offenses trying to find their rhythm and their groove. And with how elite these defenses are, I had a feeling it was going to be like this a little early on. But in the second half, Georgia was able to pull ahead. And when you look at it, and I just talked about this with the talent level, when it gets down to winning time, it's going to come down to who has the best talent. And especially when it comes down, and especially when you're looking at week 1. Week 1 has a lot to do with who's more talented, who has the more experience. Because when you get yourself in these grudge matches, it's going to be a lot easier for the teams that have guys that have been here before, that are used to winning in big games, to kind of open up the offense and improvise and make plays for themselves, rather than the team that is so reliant on the scheme or the coaching staff to make plays for them. That's going to hurt a lot more. We saw that with a few games this week as well. Carson Beck, I felt like he really stood out to me in the second half. He did struggle a little bit early on, but that's to be expected when you have a lot of weapons that are new in this system. They lose Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey to the NFL, and so they have a lot of new guys. But I think the interesting part with this Georgia receiving core is just how much depth they have. You look at Arian Smith, you have London Humphreys, a transfer from Missouri, Dominic Lovett from Missouri and London Humphreys from Vanderbilt, 2 transfers that came from within that conference in the SEC to play for Georgia and compete for a national championship. And that's what I'm talking about when I mentioned the recruiting. You have to be able to pull guys from your rivals, from your conference, and be able to bait them with the fact that you can win a national championship, even if that means for those guys leaving a team in their conference to come and play for Georgia. That's why Clemson struggles so much as well. Maybe they should, I don't know, maybe use a transfer portal where teams are getting 50% of their rosters. But nevertheless, I do think this Georgia team is going to be a little bit different this year than the teams we've seen in the past. I think that they maybe don't have as much star power at the top end of their depth chart, especially at the receiving end. But I think they have a lot of depth, and I think that honestly makes them a little bit more dangerous when you have 3 to 4 guys and you don't know which one of them is going to go off, rather than having 1 to 2 guys that you have to just try and stop and then honestly just put the ball in the other guy's hands, right? So I think this Georgia team is going to be legit this year. I think they're dangerous. I do think it's going to take them maybe 2 or 3 weeks to really get into that rhythm, and that's okay. You don't need to be in midseason form by week 3, right? It's about being at your peak at the right time, and I think this Georgia team is going to be fine. I predicted them to dominate Clemson. Ultimately, I was right. Feels good to get that one right. And this was a Georgia offense in the second half that we remember seeing, which is impressive when you remember the fact that they're without their starting running back, ETN from Florida, who transferred over. They were still able to get the ball down the field, make the plays they needed to, and ultimately it was just too much for Clemson. I think this Clemson defense is legit. I do think they're going to be a force to be reckoned with on the defensive side in the ACC. Strong emphasis there on the defense. I think this offense is going to struggle drastically. But this Georgia team was legit, and when you look at their talent level, especially on the offensive end, eventually they're going to find the end zone, right? Eventually the playbook's going to open up. Carson Beck's going to find his guys. The running backs are going to find holes. And when your defense is on the field as much as this Clemson defense was, without the offense being able to produce, they're going to get tired. They're going to get worn down. This is SEC football that you're playing. You're not going to be able to just punt the ball 6 times in a row and expect yourself to legitimately be in a game against the number 1 team in the country. And so when you look at the second half, it's pretty dominant on the Georgia side of the ball. They forced a couple turnovers. Klubnik had, I think, 2 interceptions, and they just had nothing going for him, unfortunately. I think coming into his tenure at Clemson, there's a lot of hype around Klubnik, especially when you look at the guys that have come before him, the Deshaun Watsons, the Trevor Lawrences, guys of that nature, and I just don't think he's up to that level. I understand he was a touted prospect coming out of high school, but when you look at his intangibles, he just lacks the decision-making. He doesn't always make the right read, and then I think once you get to that level, eventually when he does try to make the right read, then he's overthinking, and that's the last thing you want as a quarterback, is a guy that doesn't know where to go with the ball, and then when he thinks he should go somewhere with the ball, now he's hesitating, now he's not sure, and that's what leads to turnovers and inaccurate passes, and we saw a lot of that as Georgia dominated Clemson in an opening week. Now the nightcap, College Game Day was here in College Station as Texas A&M hosted the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame. This was really a grudge match. It wasn't a game that was going to have you on the edge of your seat. I understand it was a close finish, but it wasn't the most entertaining game that I've ever watched. It was Riley Leonard, quarterback at Notre Dame now, transferring in from Duke, going up against his former coach in Mike Elko, who is now at the helm at Texas A&M. And the big storyline coming into this game was the inexperience on the Notre Dame offensive line, right? This is an offense that hasn't spent a ton of time together. Like I just said, Riley Leonard comes in from Duke. You're starting 3 freshmen on the offensive line. And in a hostile environment like College Station, I feel like they did a pretty good job, honestly. I thought this offensive line was impressive. I feel like they held their own. Yes, there were some miscues. There was a couple false starts, a couple holding penalties that were costly, but they did what they needed to do to win. And especially in week 1, a lot of times that's just what it takes. You have to be able to find ways to win. Things are going to be ugly. They're not going to be perfect, but you have to do whatever it takes to win. And this offensive line did that. Early on, there was a lot of sloppy penalties on both sides of the ball. Unfortunately, A&M gets called with targeting early on in the first quarter, and that sets up Notre Dame for a field goal. And we saw that a lot in the first half. A lot of teams trying to capitalize off penalties and offsides calls. In my opinion, Connor Wyman, the one positive that he did have from the night was that he was able to get a lot of disruption on the Notre Dame defensive line, getting guys to jump off sides, forcing free plays. And that ultimately allowed them to be in a position to win towards the end of the game due to how many points they were able to tack on early in the game. Now, like I mentioned earlier with these offenses, they weren't really opening up the playbook early on. Colin Klein, in his first year at Texas A&M. He's not going to go airing the ball out with Connor Wyman, a guy who really hasn't had a ton of experience starting, especially in a big game like this. And if you're Notre Dame, Mike Denbrock, he's working with Riley Leonard. They're both new to each other. So you're not going to be throwing 20 to 25-yard strikes to open up the game. You're going to be trying to get these guys into a rhythm, into a system. And we didn't really see that. I think these defenses are pretty legit when you look at it. Notre Dame's secondary is probably one of the best, if not the best, secondary in college football. And so if you're Texas A&M, you have to rely on that run game. And Notre Dame was shutting that down as well. So it really limits what you can do offensively on that side of the ball. But if you're Notre Dame, I think they did find a way to just win in the trenches, not by a lot. It wasn't, you're not watching the game and saying, oh, Notre Dame is dominating these guys at the line of scrimmage. But they did what they needed to do. And especially when you have a quarterback like Riley Leonard, who's experienced, he's used to playing big-time football. He's able to improvise and make a lot of plays that were winning plays. I don't think he played, the game of his life. He even said after the game that he didn't figure it out until the fourth quarter. And he's right, to be honest. I mean, he wasn't great. He didn't do anything crazy with his arm. But when it came down to making plays that were going to win or lose the game, he's able to make plays to ultimately help them get the win. Now, this is a key sequence that stuck out to me in this game is to start out the second half, right? Notre Dame gets stopped to bring up 4th and 1 in their own territory. And Marcus Freeman decides to go for it twice. He goes for it on 4th and 1 the first time, and they get that. Couple plays later, they bring up another 4th and short, and he decides to go for it again. Now, they don't get it on that conversion. They get stopped short on what I thought was probably a questionable spot. I thought he did get the first down with Riley Leonard keeping it there on the QB sneak. But nevertheless, I think it showed that Marcus Freeman has a lot of confidence in this offensive line, and that's what you need to instill in your players a lot of times. Yes, it's a big game. It's loud. You're on the road in an SEC hostile environment. But he gave these guys confidence, and I think that proved dividends later down the road when you just look at how the game shaped out. The offensive line was ultimately able to get some pushes and set up some key blocks that allowed some Notre Dame rushing touchdowns to win them the game. And yes, they didn't get this 4th down conversion early on, but I think it was a temporary inconvenience for a permanent improvement. And I think that this Notre Dame offense kind of just pounded the rock the whole game. They were waiting for something to open up. They knew that if they could continue to put pressure on this A&M defensive line, eventually they were going to wear down. And that was the case. And that's just really something to look out for as Notre Dame goes on throughout this year, is this offensive line and how they continue to develop throughout the year. I talked about this earlier. I think the big difference in this game is the experience. The big game experience ultimately proved to be the difference between A&M and Notre Dame. When you look at Riley Leonard, yes, last year he had a season-ending injury, but before that, he was on a Duke team that took down Clemson. He was on a Duke team the year prior that was in the mix for an ACC championship. And so when you have that big game experience and you're able to know what plays to make, what defense to expect, it helps you a little bit improvise, especially on a team that hasn't spent a ton of time playing together. Notre Dame is no doubt one of the most talented teams in the country, but it's not always about who has the most talent. It's about being able to conjoin those guys together and be able to get them on the same page, right? And so when you have a quarterback that can improvise and make plays on his feet, it makes things a lot easier. We saw this a couple times towards the end of the game, a couple botched snaps, guys aren't open downfield. He's able to extend the play and pick up yardage on his feet that would put them in scoring position. Now, in the fourth quarter, Notre Dame's last drive to put them ahead with the touchdown, we saw him finally start to make plays downfield with his arm. We saw him find his receivers 15, 20 yards down the field to march the ball right down and punch it in the end zone. And with Notre Dame, that's going to be the key for them this year. They have to be able to stay balanced with the run and the pass. They can't be too dependent on pounding the ball on the ground with Riley Leonard and they can't be too dependent on the ground game with Jeremiah Love and Riley Leonard, as great as those guys are on their feet. And they also can't rely on Riley Leonard to just air it out all over teams, because that's not the kind of quarterback he is. He does a little bit of both. He likes to mix it up. He's kind of unpredictable. Last year he didn't throw for a ton of touchdowns, so I definitely don't think he's a guy that you have to worry about him throwing it all over the yard. But he can make plays, and we saw that this game, and he made just enough plays to win. And as for A&M, that was the difference maker, right? This is a team that, similar to Notre Dame, hasn't spent a ton of time together, but the difference was their quarterback didn't have the experience that Notre Dame's did. Connor Weigman, I think he has a chance to be really talented. This game, we didn't necessarily see that. This offense was really limited in what they were able to do. He struggled to find his weapons. And similar to Clemson, I feel like this was the same thing with Texas A&M. There's no one lining up in this Texas A&M wide receiving core that has the Notre Dame secondary worried, right? We know how talented this Notre Dame defense is, but if you're Texas A&M, you have to be able to put a guy out there that is going to be a threat down the field. You have to be able to prove to this Notre Dame defense, hey, we're going to air the ball out, and you're going to have to worry about this guy for the rest of the game. They didn't have that, in my opinion. They were really dependent on Le'Veon Moss, who I did feel like had a great game, but you're not going to be able to rely on your running back to be your best threat in the passing game. You're not going to be able to win big games like that, especially against a team that might be a playoff team this year in Notre Dame. And with Connor Weigman, I just didn't feel like he was able to find his rhythm. We saw this a lot early in the game with just short throws, short route combinations, trying to find his rhythm, trying to get the ball to his weapons. And throughout the game, he just struggled to do that. There was never really a point in the game where I felt like, okay, yeah, now he's rolling. Now he's got it figured out. I felt like, and that's credit to Notre Dame's defense. They were very disruptive. They were able to get in the lanes and make plays. He threw 2 interceptions, and so I think if you're Notre Dame, that's definitely something that you give credit to your defense for, but also from an objective point of view, I don't think Connor Weigman is a guy that's going to be taking this Texas A&M team to another level. And coming into the game, I was really shocked watching game day in the morning how many of them expected Texas A&M to win this game simply just because they're at home. I understand how hard it is to win at Kyle Field. I understand the 12th man and all the hype around what it's like to play at Texas A&M. But when you look at the team, I just didn't see anything offensively that really made me jump out that I was like, okay, they're going to be able to pull ahead. They're going to be able to make plays and win this game. And that showed itself on the field. They weren't able to move the ball at all. There was no driving the ball down the field in the air. I understand they were able to tie the game up late. It was sort of a choppy possession. They were finally able to get a little bit of run game going on the ground. They had some penalties help them out. But I did feel like Notre Dame was in control of this game the whole time, which is weird to say when the final score was as close as it was. But I just wasn't really impressed with A&M and what they had to offer. I think Mike Elko's a great coach. I think defensively this Texas A&M team is going to be really good. I think that's what's going to keep them in a majority of these games this season against tough SEC opponents. But the offense is going to have to step up. They're going to have to be able to make plays. I think they will improve. I think Colin Klein has been a proven offensive coordinator in college football. I think he's going to be able to work well with Weidman and get him on the same page. But I don't know if they're necessarily a playoff team like a lot of people say they are. I just think that they have a lot of developing to do. And especially under a first-year coach, it's going to take time. It's going to take time to develop these guys. You got to get your own recruits in, get your system and your schemes all under control with the guys that you want to execute those schemes. And you're not always going to see that in year one. I understand, Alabama brings in Kalen DeBoer and they're immediately playoff hopefuls. But I don't think that's the case with A&M. A&M didn't even make the playoff in years where they had the number 1 recruiting class in the nation under Jimbo Fisher, or years prior when there was the Johnny Manziels or the Mike Evans, when they had guys of that nature. They were never in the national championship hunt, right? And so for them to come into this season with so much new and so many questions, I feel like it was pretty unrealistic to think that they're going to be a playoff hopeful. For Notre Dame, I think that this is a team that possibly could when you look at their schedule. A lot of winnable games. They have some tough opponents towards the end of the year. But I think that they're going to be able to run the table, especially as an independent where you're not having to play for a conference championship game. It does limit them in the sense that they're going to have to be one of the 7 at-large bids because they're not able to go and win their conference, which I think will have to change down the road. I think they're going to have to join the ACC or Big Ten or someone sooner rather than later. But I just think that they're going to be able to run the table. Their defense is really smooth. I think the offense will develop. I really liked what I saw in the run game with Jeremiah Love and Riley Leonard. I think Leonard will continue to develop as the year goes on. And ultimately, Notre Dame was able to get a big win in Week 1 in College Station. We're going to mix it up here. We got a couple segments for you guys. Before we get out of here, it's going to be a shorter episode this week, just due to the fact that it's kind of simply more focused around college football. But the top performers of the week, I got 3 of them, actually 4 of them with an honorable mention, and we're just going to hop right into that. Number 1, I have Ashton Jaunty, the running back from Boise State. Huge game against Georgia Southern in a game that was closer than I expected, and I think a lot of people expected. He goes for 20 carries, 267 yards, and 6 tuds. Those are just video game numbers right there. We understand John T is a guy for Boise State. When he came back, we immediately knew that they were going to be contenders. We thought Malachi Nelson was going to get the starting job. Ultimately, it's Maddox Madsen that gets that starting position at the quarterback. And this game was close. I mean, you look at it, it was a shootout. The scoreboard doesn't necessarily indicate how close the game was in the fourth quarter. Georgia Southern had the lead late in the third and even early on in the fourth. But Boise State was able to pull away primarily due to how dominant they were on the ground, and all that credit goes to Ashton Jonty on the ground game for Boise State. At number 2, Travis Hunter. We all talked about him earlier. We all know how important he is to this Colorado team. He goes 7 receptions for 132 yards and 3 touchdowns. The last one ultimately sealing the game for the Buffs as they were able to escape FCS North Dakota State with the win. And when you look at Travis Hunter, this is going to be a name that's around college football and the NFL for a long time, right? He's already made his mark at a Colorado program that was miserable before his arrival, along with Shedeur Sanders and Deion Sanders. But he just does so much for this Colorado team that without him, who knows where they're at, right? Offensively, you know what he does. He makes big plays over the top. He has relentless speed. He's able to run through guys. He's physical. And on the defensive side of the ball, he's involved with plays. He's not maybe getting as much pass breakups as we would like to see, but that's because no one's throwing the ball his way, right? When you have a cornerback that has the hands that he does, you're not going to want to be throwing a ton of deep balls and balls that he can get to his way, right? You want to be thrown away from him. And I think outside of that, he's making plays on the ball. He's getting involved in tackle. He's getting involved in the run game in terms of tackling running backs. And this guy seeks contact. He's a football player. And he had a really impressive week 1. I think we're going to see a lot more of that from week 2. Week 3 is kind of a surprise for those of you that were staying up late on the West Coast watching some Big Ten After Dark now. I have Jonah Coleman. He had a big game for the Washington Huskies. He goes 16 carries for 127 yards and 3 touchdowns. This guy was a stud at Arizona under Jedd Fisch. I think he kind of flew under the radar last year, especially when you look at Arizona, a team that, in my opinion, was underrated throughout the year in just terms of how good they were and how competitive they were by the end of the season. But Jonah Coleman's a beast. He looks like a tight end and runs like a running back. I mean, he's huge. It takes him 2 to 3 guys to tackle him. He is just so aggressive in how he runs the ball. Every run he has, he runs angry. And Washington's not afraid to hide that. We saw in their first possession of the game. In 2 carries, Jonah Coleman goes the length of the field and scores a touchdown that ultimately gets called back for penalties. But throughout the game, we saw how aggressive he was, how hard it is to bring this guy down. And he had a big game as Washington takes care of Weber State 35-3. Now at number 4, and finally, I have Tertora McMillan. Excuse me if I messed his name up. But this guy is a stud, right? He was Jonah Coleman's former teammate at Arizona. Him and Noah Fafita. A lot of people thought they were going to leave to come to the portal and maybe pursue him, follow Jedd Fisch to Washington. Ultimately, he decides to come back. Picks up right where he left off last year with 10 receptions for 304 yards and 4 touchdowns. I think this Arizona team is going to be dangerous in the Big 12. I think they're going to make a lot of noise. I understand that they played New Mexico, but nevertheless, this is a big win for them. And I just think that this Arizona team is dangerous, especially when you have a wide receiver at the caliber of McMillan. Now, before we wrap it up, we're going to get into our final segment here. Red light, green light. If it's a green light, it's something I really liked from the week. If it's a red light, it's something to be concerned about. And yeah, that's basically the way it goes. Pretty self-explanatory. So we'll get started off. Number 1, my first green light is Miami. I thought the Hurricanes might have been on upset alert this week before this game kicked off, and I couldn't have been more wrong. They came in, they dominated. Cam Ward looked great. Damian Martinez in that backfield makes them just even that much more dynamic. This Miami team is going to be seriously dangerous this year, I think, especially in the ACC. When you look at the lack of, when you look at their schedule, they're just not very deep, right? They don't have a ton of tough games. I think they go to Florida State, and that's about it. They don't have to play Clemson or NC State or some of these tougher teams in the ACC. And with how dynamic this offense is, I think they're going to be able to blow a lot of teams out of the water and just run away from them. I think this defense played really well. I understand Florida doesn't have the most explosive offense of all time, but I think this defense is going to be able to make plays. When you look at Michel Powell, coming over from Washington, That's a great playmaker. We saw him make some plays yesterday with an interception. I think this defense is just going to give teams the fits, and then when you have an offense that has so many weapons like this Miami school does, they're just going to be able to run teams up and shut them out. I think especially in the ACC, Miami's the threat to win it. If I had to pick right now, they'd be my favorite to win the conference, and so my green light goes to Miami. As for the red light, the rest of the ACC, I feel like we've already talked about this, but Florida State loses week 0 in Ireland to Georgia Tech, and Clemson got demolished in week 1 by Georgia. Now, look, we knew before heading into this season this wasn't going to be a very deep ACC conference. Yes, there's some sleeper teams, maybe North Carolina State make a run at the table. A lot of people had Virginia Tech. They just lost to Vanderbilt in week 1. So not a ton to be excited about if you're an ACC fanatic. Yes, Miami looked great, like we just talked about, but the rest of the conference looked pretty weak. And for a conference that is struggling to lose teams that maybe want to leave for more money or TV deals or whatever, it doesn't help that your conference is probably one of the weaker Power 4 conferences in the nation. So the ACC, I'm not super high up on it. I talked about it last week. I don't think they're deep. I don't think they have a ton of talented teams. Even if Miami is able to come out of the conference, I think compared to the rest of the country, they're probably not as talented or developed as the Georgias, the Ohio States, teams like that. Penn State, they get a green light. They dominated West Virginia in a game that I thought was going to be close. A lot of people thought it was going to be close. I even saw some predictions that had West Virginia pulling off the upset in Morgantown. But Drew Aller looked great. I thought the run game was great. The biggest thing that stood out to me with this Penn State team this year is the progress from Drew Aller. We understand that the defense is going to be talented. They're going to rely on the run game. But Drew Aller's ability to drive the ball down the field is what stood out to me this game, and we saw it a little bit at the end of the first half when they get the ball with a little under 30 seconds left, and they're able to march down the field on 3 to 4 plays and put it in the end zone, where he's driving the ball 20 to 25 yards down the field. He finds his targets on fade routes in the end zone. We didn't see that as much last year. He was pretty conservative, a lot of short drag routes, stuff underneath, bubble screens, jabs, and I just think the next step as a quarterback is being able to drive the ball downfield. Yes, it's important to make the right reads and find your checkdowns when necessary, but for a team that wants to be in the national championship conversation, you have to have a quarterback that can make plays downfield. I think we saw this week from Penn State. I think they're going to be a force to be reckoned with in the Big Ten this season, so Penn State gets a green light from me. Red light, Oregon. For those of you that know me personally, not the biggest Oregon fan, but even without that, I think that this was a sketchy game for them. I talked to some people that are big Duck fans, and they were worried. When you look at the box score of this game and you don't know the score, you think, okay, Oregon blew them out. Dylan Gabriel threw all over the field. He had nearly 50 passing attempts and almost 400 yards. They probably smoked him. Well, that wasn't the case. They squeaked by the Idaho Vandals 24-14 at Autzen. And I think the biggest problem for this Oregon team was some penalties. They had 8 penalties for 60 yards. That's not necessarily a ton, but that's not the type of football you want to be playing throughout the year at all, especially as the competition gets tougher. You're going to have to play clean games, and you're not going to be able to just give up yards in penalties. I think this offense is very explosive. We saw that. Tez Johnson is really good. Evan Stewart is a freak of nature. And the run game with Jordan James is just going to be super dynamic. I think this Oregon team is really good. I don't have really any worries about them, but I did think it was concerning how they weren't able to pull ahead from this Idaho team. I saw some holes in the defense that I didn't love. I know FCS teams and smaller schools are going to get pretty creative in big games like this because they have nothing to lose, but there were some holes in the secondary that concerned me. Idaho was able to drive the ball down the field on a couple of deep throws, especially when you have a secondary as talented as Oregon's is. It does make you ask some questions. Is it scheming? Were there just guys in wrong spots on missing assignments? I do think this Oregon team is ultimately going to be A-okay. I think they're going to run the table, but not a great start to the year if you're hoping to win a national championship. Green light, Cam Rising's back for the Utah Utes, and he picked up right where he left off 2 years ago, 255 yards and 5 touchdowns versus Southern Utah. Now listen, I know it's Southern Utah, I get it, but to have his injury that puts you out for an entire season and then to come back and have the game that Cam Rising did, that's important. It's important for your confidence, it's important for your coordinators, And it ultimately lets the whole program know that, listen, we don't have to wait on me, the quarterback, to try and pick up where I left off and slowly progress back into it. He's right into it. I think this Utah team is dangerous this year. I think they're going to run the table in the Big 12, so watch out for the Utes. Finally, red light, the Minnesota Firework crew. If you watch that game on Thursday, I believe, it could have been Friday, Minnesota goes to kick a game-winning field goal, they miss it, and the fireworks still go off like they won the game. Unfortunately for the Gophers, they lose to North Carolina in their season opener at home. In what was a weird game, Max Johnson goes down early in that one, the quarterback for North Carolina, in a season-ending injury. Prayers up for him. But it looked like a back-and-forth game. It looked like Minnesota was going to have a chance to go down and win it. Ultimately, they do get in field goal range, and they do miss the 47-yard field goal to win it. That puts them at 0-1 to start the season. But the fireworks says they won, and maybe that's all that matters if you're a fan of moral wins. That's going to do it for episode 3 of Chop It Up. College football is back. We're excited about it. We're going to be more involved on social media. Be sure to go check us out on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Like and subscribe. We're going to start getting some guests on here, getting their opinions. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.